Hey, hey, we've reached the end of the development unit, so you have only a few more units with me before you are completely done with your content coverage for AP Psychology. Nice thing about this set of notes too is that it's pretty quick, so we're just going to motor through these guys and get stuff done, okay? So when we talk about early to middle adulthood, we reference it as ages 20 to 65. Now, I know to you guys as teens, 65 seems a little bit of a stretch for middle adulthood, but considering life expectancy, or at least the average life expectancy, is up in the 80s, we do still consider that to be a fairly middle adulthood style scenario up to 65. So let's talk social development, okay? Early adulthood is far more often than not centered around careers, okay? And ultimately aspects of formulating relationships that of significant attachment, like getting married and things along those lines. Okay, and so you see in this scenario situations of midlife transitions that around 40s ish. That's when you ultimately start to see people kind of connecting back to that Erik Erikson scenario of generativity versus stagnation, kind of looking back over things, looking at your accomplishments, questioning your life and the decisions that you've made, maybe wanting to change jobs or get into a new different activity or things like that. And we do think that that's mainly because of physical changes that start to happen. Women will, in their 40s, begin to move into, if they have not already, menopause or premenopause. Perimenopause is what it's also known as. Men start to slow down in terms of their functioning, and so when you have those physical changes and you feel yourself starting to get a little slower physically, it certainly causes certain brain functionings to start to occur, which is that the reality is you're only getting older and life's getting shorter, and so that ends up having that consequence of the person kind of looking back over their life and going through that midlife transition. But for most people, the passage into middle age, for the most part, is pretty common and pretty calm and not really anything of significant focus. Instead of looking at the past or the future, they focus on the present and they try to come to terms with certain aspects of their realities with life. When we talk about marriage and children and family, as we made a quick mention to just a little bit ago, during these stages, people are still getting married. Rates of living together and divorce are higher. So people, while you're still seeing lots and lots of individuals getting married and following that traditional parameter of things, higher levels of living together and higher divorce rates are also present. Okay, around 90% of heterosexual adults will marry. I don't have any updated statistics since gay marriage has been legalized to provide a percentage for you on that regard. But 75% of divorcees will remarry, and so that's an important component to add to that whole thing in terms of the mix of percentages of people going through with a marriage. About 50% of first marriages end in divorce, and that's a pretty high statistic when you take a look at that. And that's lent itself towards all different kinds of cultural shifts for things, and we'll learn about this in Unit 14, the concept of blended families. I know many of you guys have step siblings, half siblings. Many of you guys I've taught siblings, and I didn't even know that they were siblings because you guys had different last names. And so there's lots of different blendings of families now, which lends itself toward different dynamics and structures as well in terms of family components. Something of significance to focus and take a look at too, in particular with regard to the adulthood component, is the changing role of women, both at home and outside the home. Close to 75% of all married women with school-aged children work outside the home. So 25% do still stay at home to be able to make sure that they're there for their children and be a stay-at-home mom. Interestingly enough, there is a major component that oftentimes gets overlooked, particularly for women in these adulthood scenarios, which is what's referred to as the second shift. Because for many women, when they come home from their 9 to 5 work outside of the house job, They then have to come home and take on the responsibilities in terms of the majority of the housework. They cook, they clean, they pick up after their kids, they help their children with homework, for example. Arlie Hochschild actually ended up, through some research, because they ended up studying this pretty intently, they estimated that working moms put in an extra month of 24-hour days during the course of an entire year. And so if you look at that in terms of just kind of averaging out the number of hours in a day that working mothers are kind of on the clock, so to speak, both out of the house and inside of it, that can certainly lend itself toward that midlife transition scenario, for example, or cause women to definitely kind of take a look at things for themselves. That said, most women that work outside of the home report having a personal sense of satisfaction. They're proud of themselves for the work that they do. They have a strong sense of contributing to society. Many working women, myself included, like the message that they are sending to their own children, particularly their daughters, that it is possible to have a successful career outside of being a mom, and that it is attainable if you focus on it and work toward it. Let's talk late adulthood real fast. Lots and lots and lots of physical changes happening in late adulthood. Okay, this is when your hair starts to gray, it thins out, skin begins to wrinkle. There is a slight loss of height, because ultimately over time we do kind of tend to hunch over. I myself have noticed this an awful lot about myself. My posture is pretty terrible, so I'm noticing that I hunch an awful lot, and I'm trying to make sure that I straighten that up. But I mean, if you think about it, gravity over a period of 80 years is going to definitely take its toll on you in terms of pushing you down. So it makes sense then a little bit that there's that slight loss of height, and especially if there are issues with osteoporosis and things like that, that could also contribute. The senses are an awful lot less sensitive. So think about your grandparents who, you need to basically scream in their ear in order to get them to hear you better, for example. Or, as is the case with my grandpa, they're cold all the time. If you go to my grandpa's house, the thermostats is like 82. It's pretty toasty in there, and even with that warmth level being what it is, there's still multiple layers that he's wearing. Reaction time also slows, and then with that, obviously there's a change to physical stamina as well. They're just not as quick as they used to be. They're not as energetic as they used to be, and so when you look at the question of what causes that, it kind of depends. There's the genetic programming theory of aging, which is just, we have a built-in time limit for the reproduction of cells. Okay, so if you look at it in that regard, I'm not a particular fan of it because it seems kind of crude and unfeeling and unthinking. But it's kind of like a self-destruct button in the sense that it's been pushed, and so now you're just kind of less viable, if you will, genetically speaking, and so the body is breaking down and demonstrating that fact. There's also just the wear and tear theory, which is just you've been on the planet for a really long time, and eventually, the body's gonna give out, just like any other thing that is, that ages and gets yellowed with time, if you will. So there's plenty of different answers for why that is the case. There are cognitive changes that occur too, specifically with regard to fluid and crystallized intelligence. You'll hear these terms come up again when we covered Unit 11 with intelligence in general, but it's important to recognize there is some decline in intellectual functioning during the late adulthood stage, specifically with regard to fluid intelligence, which is abstract reasoning and thought processing. Okay? Their crystallized intelligence, however, that stays pretty steady because crystallized intelligence is accumulated knowledge. It's facts. So it's very similar to that the declarative memory, the explicit memory component for things. That stays pretty stagnant because, if you've been living on the planet for a long time, you're going to acquire an awful lot of knowledge and facts and accumulated information. So if you think about it in that sense, this would ultimately be why it is that your grandparents are very set in their ways. They don't understand new things like fads and, why you want to wear your hair the way that you do or why you speak the way that you do. A lot of that is because their fluid intelligence has decreased and diminished to some extent, and they have difficulty recognizing that they were young once too sometimes, and there were fads and there were specific ways of talking and things like that when they were young. Does memory decline with age? That's a pretty big question that is often the focal point of studying late adulthood. The interesting thing is most evidence shows that it doesn't really. Now, certainly there are scenarios of memory loss due to disease like Alzheimer's, like dementia, but neural processing slows down to some extent that obviously then ends up making it possible for it to be a longer time frame for you to process through memories. But if memory loss happens, it's usually connected to episodic memory, which is, remember, your kind of personal slant or tilt toward the semantic knowledge, okay, the facts, the accumulated knowledge that you've gotten. So other types of knowledge are largely unaffected by age, that procedural memory, the implicit stuff, even declarative memory in terms of acquiring those facts and accumulated pieces of knowledge. Interestingly, if a person stays active, both physically and mentally, their memory loss is virtually non-existent. So if you have a grandparent who stays active, they're retired, and they stay active by playing crossword puzzles or Sudoku or other different types of games and stuff like that, or they make sure to go out with friends, once every every Monday night for dinner to stay connected with people. That really does have a pretty significant impact in terms of them maintaining their memory functionality. In terms of the social world, since we just got done talking about it, how does one successfully age, especially when it comes to the fact that the unfortunate reality is that everyone does pass away at a different point. And the older you get, the fewer friends you have because you're lasting longer and they're not. So how does one successfully age? You could go with the disengagement theory, which is just that aging produces a gradual withdrawal from the world on a physical, psychological, and social level. Because if you think about it, as you age, you get slower. It's harder to do things physically. Sometimes it's just not worth it to you and your mind to leave your house because it's harder for you to maneuver around. And so then you stay home. And then because you stay home, you're not interacting with people as well. And that in and of itself isn't a bad thing, because disengagement does give you an opportunity for an awful lot of reflectiveness over your life, evaluating yourself, and certain things are flaws. Decreased emotional investment in others is, something that can happen. And sometimes that's kind of a little bit of a defense mechanism too, in the sense that if you spend less time with people, when they do pass, it's a lot less emotionally taxing, which sounds kind of unpleasant to think of it that way, but it's true. You could also go with the activity theory of aging, which is just that people who do age more successfully are the ones that maintain things that they found interesting and engaging even during early or middle adulthood, okay? So it should reflect a continuation of early and middle adulthood life rather than, a ceasing of certain things that you do. So the question becomes, which one's better? It's entirely dependent on the individual, and certainly personality plays a pretty critical role in this. If you're a natural extrovert anyway, and you gain joy from being around lots and lots of people and engaging with people and doing new things, then obviously the activity theory is definitely going to be better for you. But if you are a natural introvert and you're more quiet, more shy, more cautious, it's entirely possible that disengaging from the people around you and just kind of sticking to yourself in terms of that reflective process can be better for you. Just kind of depends. So one of the last things to discuss is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, or the stages of death and dying. She spent a lot of her career studying tragedy, and particularly people's responses to tragedy, and whether it's possible to kind of predict how people go through cycles of grief as it relates to those events. And the reality is that she came up with 5 stages that she felt all people face during a death or grieving experience. These are not in any particular order, and it's important to recognize that. You don't go through these in a very systematic or sequential manner. It's possible for you to jump back and forth between some of them, And even after you've hit acceptance, for example, to go back into the anger or bargaining or depression scenario. So you can see these stages when dealing with a lot of traumas that are accounted for in life, because the unfortunate reality of life is there are only two definitives in life, and that's death and taxes. You know that death will be presented to you in your life at some point. So virtually every one of us will go through this scenario, even if it's down to just the loss of a pet or the loss of a significant relationship. It's still entirely possible for you to go through these 5 stages. So you have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Okay. I'll take this from my personal scenario, since you guys know I've been pretty open with you guys about the significance of the loss of my dad. My dad passed away at the age of 56. I was 28 when it happened. And it was a very, very, very sudden loss. My dad told my stepmother that he was going upstairs and going to bed, and he never made it. He had a massive heart attack before he ever got into bed, and he passed away instantaneously. I never got to say goodbye. I can take very good, I don't, what's the word I'm looking for? I can take a sense of peace with me. That the last words that I ever spoke to my dad were, "I love you." I told him that when we were getting off the phone with one another, and I spoke to him the day before he died. But I still find myself going through these different stages at various different points. Initially when I first was told that my dad had passed, it was so surreal. I didn't even really understand what was going on, and it didn't feel as if it was reality in any way. And I still find myself going through this even as I tape this video 6 years after I've lost him. So it will be 6 years in about 6 days. 6 days. There are still times when I find myself experiencing anger, that it's not fair that he's gone, that it's not fair that he's going to miss getting to witness my daughter or any future children that I have grow up. It's not fair that my dad wasn't there for my wedding, that he won't be there for my younger brother, or he wasn't there for my stepsister's wedding. There are points that I have come to accept that reality, that that it is what it is. I've learned, and I often share this with my students when they're struggling with their own senses of grief, you develop a new normal. It's not that you've forgotten them or that you've moved on. You just adjust accordingly. And so you find yourself maneuvering through these different stages at various different points. And so, I definitely find that Kubler-Ross's research has a pretty personal connection for me in particular. And I know that when I start looking through your vocabulary stuff, when you present her 5 stages of grief, many of you guys are going to share exactly the same thing. So this has been the end of your adulthood notes. By no means do I want to end it on a negative note, but this is your last set for the unit. So it means you're heading toward the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, on content coverage for this course. So we'll do some in-class activities as we always do, but you know the drill by this point. If you got any questions before we get to those in-class activities, just ask.